Good afternoon. It's so good to see so many of you here today. This is our third installment or episode or whatever you want to call it of Tell Me a Story. We have 5 folks who have agreed to share an episode, an event, or accumulation of events from their lives today. And we thank each of you for being willing to do that, to share those with us today. Thank you for coming. When you have a story to be told, it really helps to have somebody to listen to that story, doesn't it? They are going to entertain you. They are going to inspire you. And I hope that they do inspire you to consider stories in your own life that, even if you don't want to tell them to a group collected like this, that you might want to consider recording in some way for your family or sharing with friends. That is part of our purpose in doing this, is the hope that it will generate some stories from others to share. We have 5 different speakers and some different situations for them. It's important that we know that you can hear, that it's not too loud and not too soft. So just communicate that with us, if you will, during this session, because it's very important that you be able to hear what folks are saying. Our first storyteller is Betty Cook. She and Bob live in East Apartments, and they have lived here since May of 2000. Betty, would you come and be our first storyteller?
I'll try.
All right. Good.
I think I need it slower. Can you hear me? Yes. Too loud? Thought you seemed too excited. I was too loud. This is a rather unusual story, but I promise you it is true, and I have Bob here to back me up. So if you can't believe me, I think you'll believe him. Bob had just been drafted into the Army, and he was stationed at Fort Knox. I was working as a home economics agent in West Virginia and pregnant, and he decided that we should both start living at Fort Knox. Bob was in officer's training, living in the barracks, and could only come home on weekends. When we decided we were going to Fort Knox, we discovered that living there was a hard thing to do. I can't talk now, let me think. Apartments were scarce, and so were places to put a trailer. But we decided to buy a trailer, 19 feet long. Yes, I still love trailers, by the way. We finally found a spot to live on a very short lot. It was on a slant, and it was so short that the back of our trailer stood out over a ravine. I think we got the spot because our trailer was short, and so was that spot. The trailer park itself was small and laid out in a circle. Everyone became friends, and you almost felt like you were a part of a family with brothers and sisters. And we still write to some of those people that we knew 60 years ago in this situation. One Saturday, when Bob and most of the men were home, our area in Kentucky had a tornado warning, even though the sky was blue. All I could think of was the end of our trailer hanging over that ravine. I started suggesting that we put concrete blocks or something behind the wheels of that trailer with that ravine behind us. Bob kept telling me there are no chances that a tornado is going to hit our little trailer. Even the neighbors joined in the conversation. But I think to keep me quiet, Bob decided that he would join some of his friends and put some concrete blocks behind our trailer. I decided I was a pretty good nagger, and he probably says I still am. Evening came, no clouds in the sky, and we went to bed. About midnight, there was a real loud boom, and our trailer moved. It was pushed backwards. Well, by this time, I was 8 months pregnant, but somehow I crawled out of bed over Bob and got to the door. There on our little porch stood a great big Kentucky constable with a gun in his hand. I'm not kidding. And he was yelling, "Stop, I'm going to shoot to kill." I wasn't sure whether he meant me or Bob. I was surprised I didn't have our baby Debbie then and there. But the constable explained to Bob that 2 boys had wired their grandfather's car and stolen it. He was trying to catch them. The boys had circled into our little trailer park, traveling fast. They had wired the motor. You remember know how you do this, I don't. So it would run, but you couldn't stop it. Well, they were coming around the circle of this trailer park, and the 2 boys jumped out of the car, so their car hit our trailer right in the front. But these men had put those blocks behind those wheels. By that time, and all the noise, all the neighborhood came in. Those cement blocks were in the ground with just a little V sticking out of them. That's what I said. Those cement blocks that had been put there just that day was what saved Bob and I from going into that ravine. We were both convinced, I think everybody was, that if we had gone over that ravine, we would either have been killed or hurt very seriously. Well, the next morning we got up, the tow truck was gone, and we never heard a thing about the boys again. But we are still puzzled when we think of this event. Was the whole thing coincidental? Having the tornado warning with the blue sky, the placing of blocks, the stolen car hitting us, my nagging, and not being hurt or killed. Was it just coincidental? I honestly believe God had a role in saving us that day. That he had something more for us, but we're not sure what yet. But it's a day that we will never forget. And I've got to close with something kind of funny. From that day on, there in that trailer park, if I said it looks like it's going to rain, all the neighbors ran out and got their clothes off the line.
That is a story to remember, Betty. I think your purpose for staying here was to have that baby, for one thing, don't you? Our next storyteller is going to come up in her electric chair and sit right here, so you may have to stretch your necks a little bit. This is Janet Null. Janet moved to Springmore in 1992 with her husband, Frank, who was better known as Whitey. And Janet's been here 20 years. She lives in East Apartments in apartment 257. And Beth is getting her outfitted with this microphone right at mouth level so you can hear her today. Okay, this is Janet Null.
Testing. Is that loud enough?
Can you hear?
Can everybody hear?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. This event took place in the late 80s in West Hempstead, Long Island, New York. Our church had a Bible study every Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock. And I went and took care of the children while the mothers went to the Bible study. It was about 9:45 on a Tuesday morning, and I went out to the garage and backed out the car. We didn't have an electric garage door closure, so I had to get out of the car to pull the garage door down. I stepped out of the car. Unfortunately, I left the car in reverse. I stepped out. The door was, the driver's door was wide open. And as the car moved out the driveway, the door kept pushing me backwards. I thought if I could just get back in the car and put my foot on the brake, but I wasn't able to. I didn't want to damage my neighbor's property. Well, the car kept moving out of the driveway, across the street, into the neighbor's property. I was walking backwards all this time. And as we hit her stockade fence, it knocked it down, and then it hit the utility building. And when it did that, I fell to the ground. My head was facing toward the street. I was lying on my back. And I looked above my head, I could see the front wheel coming toward me. I just laid there and waited, and it ran over my shoulder. I was able to get up, but when I stood up, my arm just hung limp. I managed to get back in the car and pulled the car back to our driveway. I went into the house. I woke my husband. He was sleeping because he worked nights. And he quickly got up and got dressed. I called the church secretary and told her that I wouldn't be in that day because I had an accident. At that time, 2 teenage neighbors came over, banging on the door. They had seen everything that had happened, and they wanted to know if they could help. They called 911, and the EMS came and took me to the hospital. They didn't operate on my shoulder for 2 days because they didn't have a anesthetist available. They operated on my shoulder, and I had many weeks of therapy. My left arm isn't like it was before, but I have limited mobility, and I can only raise it this high. But I'm so thankful that the car didn't run over my head or my neck or my back. The auto insurance paid for all the medical expenses. They paid for the neighbor's stockade fence and utility building. And isn't that funny? All of a sudden my mind is blank. Even though this is a bad experience for me, my grandchildren love to hear the story. They always say, "Grandma, tell us again about how the car ran over your shoulder." I have a suggestion for all of you. If you ever get out of your car, don't ever let the car in reverse.
That's the best suggestion I've heard all day, Janet. Thank you. We're glad you didn't run over your head, too. Clancy Hofer is going to come up next. Clancy and his wife Opal moved to Springmore in February of 2003, and he lives down in East Apartments in apartment 114. And he's going to come up and kind of get in the same position here that Janet was. Not under the car.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Midnight and high noon. Does that sound like an oxymoron? As a child, I lived on a farm 10 miles from a small town in east central South Dakota. As I first recall, my father tilled the soil with horse-drawn machinery. This was slow, arduous work with long hours in the field. As I grew to the age of 7 to 8, I helped with tasks which were safe for a child. Had no particular cares, as most of my needs were met and were provided by my parents, as they were for most of the children in that age. Although we had little in the way of money, and we had few toys, except maybe the ones that my father made, or that we made out of our own improvisation. Our friends were children in school and cousins who lived nearby. When farmers and family got together, the discussions were in regard to problems on the farm and its difficulties. Or maybe Farmer Jones bought a new piece of machinery. Everyone knew everything everyone else was doing. There was little structured entertainment, except maybe a movie on Sunday, or Saturday night rather. Sunday was a day of rest and church. I don't recall of anyone working on Sunday. Life was tranquil. All this changed when the Depression hit. Money became short because the farmers had their money in some of the banks that failed. Some of the real small banks survived. With having no money, they started losing their farms, as did my father. His farm was bought by a banker in town, and he allowed us to stay on the farm as sharecroppers. Unfortunately, the drought came shortly thereafter. Rainfall became less and less, and fields had little or no vegetation, no root system at all in the soil. On a November Sunday morning, and as I think it was 1934, we were getting ready to go to church, and we saw a big black cloud in the west. And it wasn't long before everything turned pitch black. The wind blew hard until sometime through the night. We woke up to a bleakness which was unbelievable. You remember the movie The Grapes of Wrath? Mm-hmm. That movie was a perfect depiction of what we saw. And that movie was also true from West Texas all the way up to North Dakota, because that whole area, central area, was in the dust storms. We lived on a road which was just wagon tracks, and those tracks were about 6 inches deep. And when we woke up the next morning, they were level. They were level with the soil that had drifted. The landscape looked like a desert. And the storms came many times after that. Crops were planted, and they may have had enough moisture to sprout, but shriveled a short time thereafter. Temperature rose to as high as 110 degrees. Wind velocities reached 50 to 60 miles an hour. And with the high temperatures and the high winds, lakes and rivers dried up very quickly. And water was in very short supply. In fact, water was so short that I became very afraid of it. and I made my mother put a life jacket on me when she washed my face with a washcloth. By the way, that washcloth was the biggest body of water around for some time. Now, those last two statements may have been a little, somewhat of an exaggeration. Some rain did fall, and although it was only about half of the normal 20 inches per year, we did harvest some wheat. Yield was below 10 bushels to the acre, and the quality was very poor. Most of it weighed only 40 pounds to the bushel, as compared to the normal 60 pounds. And that left very little protein or starch in that kernel. As the drought progressed and the winds became stronger, topsoil began to move, causing the fields to become totally bare. The only thing that grew were tumbleweeds. And when they matured, the wind would break them loose and they would tumble up against the fence. And that would act as snow fences do. And they stopped the drifting soil, and we could literally walk over the fences. There was another problem, and that was grasshoppers. They ate everything in sight. If anything survived the drought, they ate it. There were so many grasshoppers that at noon you could look up into the sky and see clouds of them. In the extreme heat, they'd sit on the north side of some cedar fence posts, and they would chew on the fence posts. The government gave out some materials to try to control the grasshoppers, and it was a mixture of molasses and bran and arsenic. And I think the grasshoppers thrived on it. It was of very little value. It was in the late 30s when things began to change. Rain began to fall. The government leveled the mounds over the fences. Fields were planted and began to yield harvests. Farmers began to work their way out of poverty to a normal life.
Now you're going to hear from Becky Leager. Becky moved here in April of 1998. She lives in South Village, apartment 1505, and she's going to take you on a very interesting trip.
Right in front of this. Give it a test.
First, a few words of introduction. I was a child of missionary parents on the Japanese island of Kyushu and was homeschooled for 4 years. Then I was sent to the nearest English language school, Canadian Academy, in the town of Kobe on the next island, 500 miles away. Initially, I was escorted on the trip by a couple of high schoolers from Nagasaki. But this time, at the age of 11, it became necessary for me to go alone. My parents made careful plans for the trip and then sent me on my way. On the train, I was soon accosted by a drunk man who made me feel quite uncomfortable. But a fellow passenger came to my rescue and offered me his seat among much less hostile riders, most of whom had never seen a Seiyojin, a red-headed foreigner. Maybe I should explain a little bit about that. Seiyojin, red-headed foreigner. I was a brunette, but this expression, red-haired foreigner, was applied to anyone who didn't have black hair. I rode in peace until we came to the city of Saga, where all on the train had to leave and go take a ferry to the next island. A missionary we knew there met me and escorted me on the ferry and put me on the sleeper to Kobe. The crossing on the ferry was similar to what we would experience in the States. The seagulls flew about, making their usual calls. No Japanese accents there. On the train to Kobe, I was again surrounded by curious stares with very little conversation. I was too shy to start a dialogue, and so we proceeded mostly in silence. Soon it was supper time. As I unpacked my lunch, which was hard-boiled eggs, pimento sandwiches, etc., some of the Japanese had bought sushi bento, that sushi that was packed in boxes made of thin shaved wood, and a couple of chopsticks with it. Oh, how good that sushi smelled. I had a real struggle not to use a few coins in my purse to buy some Japanese picnic food instead of the dull, prosaic American lunch packed so lovingly by my mother. But I knew that missionaries were warned not to eat raw foods for fear of diseases that they might carry. Then came a quick trip to the WC for the sketchiest of ablutions, and then up the little ladder to my safety of my berth. The morning brought more lunch. By this time I was convinced I was sadly abused by my parents for having to eat it. Soon, however, I was cheered by arriving in Kobe, being met by someone from the school. There was a quick stop at a postal box to mail a pre-written card saying I had arrived, after which a very happy little girl went skipping off in eager anticipation of eating, sleeping, and playing with English-speaking children for the next 4 months.
Becky, I'm not a fan of sushi, but you made it sound delicious. Thank you for that wonderful story. Bill Bernart is our final storyteller today. Are you seeing yourself up here? I hope so, at some point. Bill and Cynthia live in South Village in Creedmoor. They've been here since November of 2008. And Bill, will you come and we'll get your microphone set up?
Am I here? I know you are. Good afternoon. In the summer of 1958, my wife Cynthia and I piled our stuff into the Chevy along with our nursing and medical credentials and our 9-month-old son Will bouncing around in the back. No child restraints back then. We headed south from Charlottesville to Virginia Beach and boarded an ancient ferry. 2 hours later, we were motoring up U.S. Highway 13 in Northampton County, the second poorest in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Located at the tip of the Delmarva Peninsula, a roadside sign proclaimed that the land of pleasant living lay directly ahead, abounding with blue crabs and oysters, sailing and fishing nearby. Our destination was the farming community of Nassawadox, an Indian name meaning land between two waters, the Atlantic Ocean and the Chesapeake Bay. A hamlet of 600 folks, it was surrounded by fields of soybeans and potatoes. The village included a bank, a shabby post office, and an elderly tomato canning factory, plus a tired-looking Texaco station. Nearby was a cluster of square, white clapboard houses, all built after World War I, when white potatoes were king. Towering over this bucolic scene was an elderly 100-bed hospital. It looked worn out, and it was. Was this place to be our home? Cindy was concerned about the public schools still segregated back then. Where's a shopping center? How about a grocery store, a dress shop, a shoe repairman? 30 miles north, she was told. My bride took several deep breaths, and we stayed for 50 years. We'll be making those hospital rounds soon, folks, but first we needed a home and an office. No space for rent, but the local bank, after close inspection of these strangers, offered us a mortgage for $6,000 to cover the purchase of one of those 50-year-old white clapboard homes, 4 rooms down and 4 up, just 200 yards from the hospital. Our patients climbed 4 steps with only a handrail for assistance into a small waiting room. Not till 30 years later did the Americans with Disability Act come along to make our aging lives much easier. On the left was my consultation room, formerly the kitchen. Cynthia, the good nurse and secretary, occupied the living room. The stairwell rose up from the waiting room. Son Will enjoyed rolling marbles down the stairs to the entertainment of the waiting patients. Our quarters included a kitchen, converted bedroom, a nursery, and a new bathtub. The walls were thin. Conversations would echo through the place. A patient was heard to exclaim, "The doctor's having fish for supper." Striped bass. Bass must have been baking upstairs. A year later, to my dismay, I overheard Cindy correcting my instructions. Quote, "No, the doctor didn't mean that. Let me do it my way." End quote. Well, that's when I diplomatically suggested she moved her professional talents to the delivery room at the hospital. And I believe she was delighted to do just that. Now for our rounds with the nursing supervisor. We enter the hospital's busy front door, mingling with patients, their families, stretchers, and several students from the Medical College of Virginia, 150 miles away in Richmond. The first floor includes the waiting room, 4 straight-back chairs, and an aged sofa. Overhead, exposed pipes and electric wires crisscross the ceiling. Next, the tiny emergency room, jammed with 3 stretchers separated by curtains, but no air conditioning, with 2 thermometers, one labeled colored and the other white. Many of you remember back in 1960 the TV bombshell Harvest of Shame, narrated by North Carolinian Edward R. Murrow. It documented the shocking living conditions of thousands of migrant laborers, many with families, moving slowly northward in early spring, planting and later harvesting crops. Over 15,000 would flood into our sparsely populated peninsula, many arriving in dilapidated Thomas-built school buses. They overflowed our villages, and on Saturday afternoon, the ABC store. Can you imagine the weekends in the emergency room? A madhouse of cut and shoots, along with local whites and blacks seeking medical care. Next, we pass the radiologist's tiny office and file through the cafeteria, where the blacks also fill their trays, but eat elsewhere. Then on to the black wards with 35 beds, surgical, pediatric, and maternity patients all crowded into small rooms. Unfortunately, it's a sweltering hot place in summer. Again, no air conditioning. But all would change in 1965 when President Johnson signed the Medicare-Medicaid bills, mandating integrated medical facilities for all. Well, that took time, 6 years in fact. Now we climb up to the second floor, where white patients await us. The 3 private rooms have air conditioning, but Ward A, with its 9 chattering women, does not. The former porch has now 3 beds. They are moved out into the hall when it rains. All floors are wooden in the old building, with much squeaking as we move along. Oh yes, there is a restroom at the end of the hall. Not very convenient for the patients, don't you agree? When the hospital census jumps to 110 or more, patients are wedged into the halls, head to toe, men and women, with oxygen tents partially blocking the way. In summer, large industrial-sized fans blow air down the hall, providing little relief. By the way, no intensive care unit is available yet. Oops, the loudspeaker is blaring. Coast Guard helicopter coming in from the Chesapeake Bay. Move all cars from the parking lot. Cinders and dust swirl around the orderlies as they offload a patient from Tangier Island, where the folks still speak with a 17th century English dialect. The top floor contains 3 operating rooms and a recovery area. When air conditioning is finally installed, the windows will be closed, shutting out mosquitoes, and roof repairs will keep raindrops from the operating table. Can you believe that? are over, folks. The Northampton Accomack Memorial Hospital. What a challenge for the staff. But we came to love the place, almost. The administrator had assured us that plenty of work and satisfaction lay ahead for the young physician and his family. He promised a new facility in just 5 years. It took 13.
From 2:30 to 2 o'clock beginning next month. So mark that on your calendars. Make note of it when you get your spring times. We will be back again next month at 2 o'clock. So let us know if you have stories to tell. We're ready to hear them. Aren't they great? Let's give everybody a hand. And we thank you very much for telling your stories today. Very good. Thank you.